Well, greetings, all of you who managed to hang out with us. We had a full room and then they disappeared and they were asking questions that were a segue into this presentation. So what we're going to do is just sort of move forward with our presentation recorded and be very thankful for those who are here. I'm Catherine Baird. I am a member of the advisory board for Star Tides. In my professional life, I was a professor of business and ethics at Regis University, a Jesuit university in Denver, and am currently the CEO of EthicsGame, which designs and distributes ethics simulations in education. My current work is in the research of the commons and the ethics of the commons. And what that means is that I'm really interested in how we do what the previous panel just talked about, which was engaging bottom-up interest, shaping the ethical norms, the ethical values of a community as we go in and either anticipate and prepare for change, respond to change, or rebuild after disaster. And so this panel will be exploring the intersection of human needs, technology, and changes in the environment. And my approach is always, and I'm deeply informed by the people on this panel because each of them have, in a very important way, informed my own work. This notion that ethics is not an individual effort, but it's a community effort. It is the way that people together come and decide how they will treat each other with respect, how they will engage the various members of the community, and then how they will decide what behaviors count for that building trust, for building relationships within them. Each of our panel members is engaged in this question from very different perspectives. And so what I'll do is introduce them, excuse me, at the beginning of their remarks, and then they will talk about 10 to 12 minutes about their approach to the various problems. The last panel was talking about how we involve members of the community. And what the work of ethicists is to begin to talk about how we do that. How do we bring the human piece into it? Now, Peter, we had a person who just teed you up, and he's in the room right now, asking how blockchain can help build systems of trust. Our first person is Peter Baxton. He is the ethicist for a company called Materium, and what he is involved with is building accountability in a very innovative way into blockchain technology. So Peter, will begin with you.
Catherine, thank you very much. As you said, I am the ethical advisor to a startup company called Materium. What I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of context about what Materium does, then what I think an ethics advisor does, or what I do for Materium, a framework of how decisions we make are made, some of the challenges, and then perhaps at the end, the single most important question I think there is to ask. So I'm going to concentrate very much on the practical aspects of this. This is my views, and it's how I have implemented it in one startup company. It's certainly not the only way to do it. Materium has technology and legal backup and insurances which allow us to fully describe a physical object, place that description on the blockchain such that anybody who is buying that item can determine exactly how it was made, who made it, what it was made from, and so on. That is legally enforceable in the vast majority of jurisdictions in the world. And we're doing this right now. We're doing it with high value items at the moment, but the intent is to be able to roll this out right the way down to the very smallest thing one could buy. Why is that important for this sort of panel and this sort of meeting? If we can obtain frictionless reselling, then we can encourage reuse. And clearly by promoting reuse, we can reduce environmental waste. And if we know exactly how it is made, then hopefully people will choose those things which are made more environmentally sustainably. And once it has come to the end of its life, exactly what it's made of can make it easier to reuse or recycle it. There's much more detail on how Materium does this through technical white papers, and materium.com is the website to go to. So what do I do as an ethical advisor for this company? What I don't do is I don't tell them what to do, what is ethical and what is not ethical. I can advise them, but it's the board that decides whether something is worth investing in or doing. I have authority from the board, but I maintain my independence from that board. And I think that's very important to do. How do I make those decisions, those advice? When we're looking at whether to partner with a company or to take on a project, there are one or two ways we could do it. We could either be the arbiter saying, this is a good thing to do, or this is not a good thing to do. Or we could be a mirror and simply say, this is exactly what this company does. This is exactly what this product is. This is exactly how this product was made, with or without forced labor or anything else. We have chosen to go down what we call the mirror route rather than the arbiter route. If we were the arbiters, it would be very difficult to maintain that. And perhaps the last question I'll come to will explain why that is in more detail. In order to make those judgments and to advise, we need to have a framework. The framework we have based it on is to come up with what other companies would call values or principles. We have elected to call them duties. Our founder, Vinay Gupta, is a great follower of Gandhi and so on. And Gandhi talks much more about the duties than about values. If one has a duty to do something, it implies a much more engaged and active engagement with something. Those duties, those values, pervade throughout our company. It's not just how we treat our customers, it's how we treat each other. It underpins the whole company. These are very much not marketing fluff or some bland statement. They should be embedded value in the company if they are to mean anything at all. The duties we've lighted on, there are some sub-bullets and I won't list all of them, is basically a duty to be trustworthy, a duty to be increasingly sustainable, and a duty to act equitably. There are many others we could have chosen, but those are the ones that we have gone with. Clearly, there are some challenges when one is trying to involve ethics in business decisions. Business ethics and the decisions on whether to invest in something or to promote a particular goods or services will result in potential conflicts. The duty of a business is to make money for its shareholders. You can't just say we're not doing that because we don't like it. If that means the business goes bust, that's not helping anybody. So clearly there are potential conflicts here. And there are conflicts in the long term and the short term. What might be short-term value for us may do long-term harm to the company. We might get a lot of profit out of one particular product, but if that harms our long-term value, then that's not a good thing. For a startup, that can be very difficult because the long term, we haven't got those resources to act necessarily in the long term. So we have to decide, is something that we are investing in right now, is that something we could live with in 10 years' time when somebody says, oh yes, but when you were a startup, you did that. Clearly that has to be the case. And clearly individuals within the company have different views about whether something is good or bad, or whether something we should invest in. So it's not just my decision as to whether something happens. We have to bring everyone along with this. So I now come to what I think is the single most important question that we asked. And I think it might actually feed into how communities can partner with businesses and non-profits. The book I made a great deal of sense to me when I was starting out in this world was by Dr. Susan Lautard, The Power of Ethics. And one of the things she talks about is edge cases. The law does not keep up with some of the stuff that we're doing. And she says, don't just say, yes, this is good, or no, that is bad. Ask when and under what circumstances would you do this? If you ask that, it's a much more sophisticated way of getting at the underlying problems that might evolve. there are, I would recommend that book to everybody. So in summary, for a business and for a startup business, we have to be able to survive in the business world if we're going to make a change. We can't afford to be, I wouldn't say picky and choosy, because clearly we have values. We're not going to do something illegal. We're not going to say something that we think is absolutely wrong. But we have to live in the real world, and we have to do things which allow us to move forward and do maybe the things that give us a great deal of value to begin with, but don't have a huge impact on our long-term aim, which is to increase sustainability and help the disadvantaged. So, Catherine, I think I'll leave it at that. Hopefully that's teed up other people to build on what I've suggested. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. We appreciate those comments, and they will be built on as we proceed. Our next speaker is John Francis. He is also a member of the advisory board of Star Tides, and I have come to know him as the Earth Walker. And while Peter focused on life at the business level, John is very much involved with life at the community level and how one talks to people who are on the margins. And so with that, John, anything else you would like us to know about you, and then your reflections on how one builds the sense of community and engages community? You have to unmute, and you have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Catherine. And Peter, it's so good to see you here today. As the first time we met, I was the ethical advisor for Strong Angel in Hawaii in 2004. And I'll go back to that in a little bit, but how I got to be an ethical advisor was a very interesting journey for me. Is that I saw an oil spill and gave up using motorized vehicles in California and just started to walk. And as I walked, I realized I was arguing with my friends and my neighbors. And so I decided that it would be a good idea if on my birthday, I would stop speaking for at least one day, because I just was arguing too much. And that one day I realized I hadn't been listening. And so I decided to not speak for another day. And eventually this ended up lasting 17 years. Because I felt that I had missed the opportunity to learn from people. And there was a lot that I was learning about myself and about the people around me. And so I maintained that vow of silence while I walked across the United States. And I did attend university, getting my undergraduate and master's and PhD in environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I am today. This journey allowed me to, very important for my development, to disengage from the narrative of race and oppression and exploitation that I grew up with, and thought that was reality. That was reality for me. But this separation, this journey, this pilgrimage, as you will, allowed me to leave that behind and be in a liminal state, I guess, as a pilgrim, and things that I would never have imagined. I started to learn about, I started to appreciate, I started to feel as a different person. I guess I rediscovered my authentic self. As I made my way across the country, my formal education to a PhD level in environmental studies allowed me to work at the US Coast Guard writing oil pollution regulations for the United States. My informal education on the road with many, many, many people in places and homes that my parents would have been afraid for me to visit allowed me to understand that environment was really about people, because people were part of the environment. And so on Earth Day, the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, I started speaking again because I felt I had something to say. And that was, yes, pollution, loss of species, habitat, all those things are important. All the things that, we traditionally think as environment problems were important. But one of the most important things that I realized was that if people were part of the environment, then how we treated each other was like our first opportunity to treat the environment in a sustainable way, and even to understand what we mean by sustainability, particularly in our relationships. So environment became about human rights and civil rights and gender equality and economic equity, education equity, all the ways that we relate to each other. And so my journey has been one of listening. I started speaking that day on Earth Day after 17 years of listening to everyone, no matter what they had to say. And I guess that working at the Coast Guard and eventually being asked, oh yes, I forgot, I walked the length of South America too. But I guess my time at the Coast Guard working with the government allowed Len to say, oh, I know someone who could maybe be an ethical advisor, and he invited me to become an ethical advisor. I had no idea what that was. And when I was in Hawaii as that ethical advisor, my job to myself was to listen and to create a safe place where we could share stories. And I did hear some, people would ask me about some ethical questions, maybe a few, but they were kind of they were having discord with the fellow participant, and they just would work that out. But afterwards, I asked, we had a hot wash, and I asked, well, I didn't feel I was advising anybody anything. And people said, well, no, John, you did a really good job, because people were saying that. I said, what? I didn't do anything. And they said, oh, but when we shared stories, we went back out into the field, and we would always say, if we had an issue or a problem, what would Dr. Francis do? And and I think that was the goal, was not to come up with any specific idea, but to just have people stop and think that maybe not what Dr. Francis would do, but what are they going to do? That this was an issue that involved some ethical questions. How are they going to solve that? And that they would stop and at least think about that there is something to think about, and something they'd have to roll up their sleeves and come up with the way that they were going to act. And as an ethical advisor, that's all I could have asked for. And I think that today, I'm like touching so many different places and so many different organizations. And I'm just started a walk through Africa. After the length of South America, my dream was to go and finish walking the length of Africa, which I started, but my wife had different ideas. She said, we have to raise a family and raise our kids. And so I took time off to do that. And now I'm in Africa. I did the first 100 miles in February this year. And I'll return to do the next 1,000 miles, and working with the GLOBE program in 18 different countries in Africa. Wow. I was walking in a township and someone said to me, John, we do so many things by just being patient and by listening. And I acknowledge that. And he said, John, you were patient. You raised your family, and now you're in Africa walking with me. John, you're in Africa. And it hit me that I was listening to. He said, yes, I am. I'm in Africa. And I have a lot more listening to do. And that's all I would say, is that we have to let go of the old narrative and really listen to this new narrative that we are becoming. And the last expression, the last thing I would say is, as we aspire to be the better human beings that we can aspire to be, so we shall become. And so I have no idea that I was going to be this person when I started out as a college dropout and hippie in California. So we're all on a journey, and I think that we all understand that we have to be kind and considerate to all of us. And, I'm going to end right there. And thank you very much for listening to me, because as a South African word, Ubuntu, I am because you are.
Thank you, John. And one of the things that I'm just resonating with Peter and John both is that people think that those of us who do ethics come in and lay down the law and we're about compliance. And we really are about asking questions about what is going on, what are you seeing, how is this moving forward, as a way of helping the various stakeholders to the conversation get clarity about what they need and what they want. And so that lays us for a foundation to go another layer deep. Our next speaker is Gaston de Lores, and I ran into Gaston because he was doing research on the same theorist I was doing work, and I loved his approach. And so I reached out to him and quoted him in my works, and he is graciously coming, and he's going to be providing another sort of a grounded business approach to how we begin to do this work. And Gaston, you are a co-presenter, so you can show your slides with impunity.
Oh, well, I thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine, and it's a privilege to speak with my fellow panelists. I guess I kind of cheated in terms of slides and put something up in the background I'll refer to in a few minutes. But first, let me tell you where I'm coming from, where the ideas that I'm addressing come from, and how I'm approaching, I think, the shared concerns that this panel is addressing. I'm trained in business ethics, but the ideas that really resonated with me were ideas developed in a subject called business policy, which became known as strategy by the 1980s in business schools. And what drew me to business policy is that it's a perspective about the role and responsibility of top management of companies, making the life and death decisions of the company. And the business policy approach recognized that not only do you need to understand the industry that you're in, but you also need to pay attention to the values of top management that are giving rise to the vision and mission of the organization. And moreover, that top management has to be responsive to the social context within which it operates, that business occupies a role in a social ecosystem and depends upon the infrastructure provided by government, the education that's provided by government. And so there's a give and take relationship. Okay, so from that standpoint, what I have sought to try to help managers and scholars make sense of is exactly how can companies approach the problems of sustainability today, when to pick up on themes that both Peter and John identified, it's very difficult to say exactly what does sustainability require, how much sustainability is enough in a given context. What does equitable mean? So these are very difficult questions, hard philosophical questions. And so I have embraced the commitment of the business policy approach, which I think Peter also alluded to, and that is not to moralize and tell people what their values ought to be, but rather attempt to help people who have certain values actually live up to them. And so the framework that I have worked on attempts to address the reality, and I'll lay this out as the basic premise of my remarks, that the existing rules of the game that we find ourselves surrounded by, and that includes law, regulation, social norms, and so on, they're never up to the task of the present. The existing rules of the game are always behind the times and may have some serious issues that are going to be sending inappropriate signals. And, you know, the bottom line in that front is the fact that our price signals are giving us very bad information. Companies, for example, find that the prices of water in developing countries are way cheaper than the price of water in more developed countries, if we accept that terminology. And that means that the incentives are exactly backwards in terms of conserving water. So our price signals are not going to be sufficient. And as important as the transparency norms are, and as valuable as they can be to give people better signals, I take the view that even transparency is not enough. And anyway, we still have to decide how much transparency is enough and what should we be transparent about. So if you are with me so far on this premise that our existing rules of the game are inadequate, then the problem is that the desire of business to pursue win-win opportunities is only going to go so far. And so I embrace the initiative of Michael Porter, a very well-known business school professor, to direct the attention of top management to the capacity to find opportunities that are actually beneficial to the profitability and competitive advantage of a company and are responsive to social and environmental issues. The problem is that we don't always find these win-win opportunities, and nevertheless, top management may find that they're in a position to make decisions about very significant social and environmental issues, such as the conservation of water. So if the existing signals from the market are inadequate and win-win opportunities can only go so far, then what next? What is the framework that I am suggesting can be helpful for top management to manage companies aligned with their own personal commitments to sustainability? And this is where the framework that I have laid out behind me comes in. And this framework is, there's nothing magical about it. It's an attempt to organize the key questions in a useful way. And so the suggestion is as follows. Whatever business and society issue we're facing, whatever sustainability issue we're facing, and I have this at, you know, above me on the top right, identify that issue. I've identified water as a very significant issue that faces many companies. How much water to use, what commitment to treat water, what commitment to make clean water accessible to the communities within which business operates. These are all very difficult and challenging questions. Now, if you're fortunate and you find yourself in a regulatory environment and a business environment where there is a win-win to address those issues, then by all means, go forward. And so that's the kind of top line here, is suggesting that if you identify the opportunity to create a win-win that is good for the business and responsive to sustainability, then by all means go forward. However, when you don't find those opportunities, and frequently we just can't, it's hard to figure out how you make more money by getting rid of forced labor. It's hard to find out how you make more money by drastically cutting your usage of water. So then what do you do? And this is where I'd like to pick back up on Dr. Francis's remarks. And that is to say that the social environment may nevertheless contain norms that are relevant for the business issue in front of the company. And so if you happen to be in, let's say, your Coca-Cola operating in India, and you're trying to figure out how to deal with your water issues, maybe there's another soda company that has come up with some other norms in a different context, and you could consider bringing those norms over. And this is what we suggest we can call norm taking. Very frequently, there are existing norms out there, maybe in another industry, maybe by another company, maybe in a different country, that can make ends meet. in terms of the business and society issue at hand. However, frequently, especially where we're talking about innovation, especially where we're talking about accelerating challenges to the environment, the reality is that even our norms are not going to be up to the task. And therefore, what we suggest is that in these cases, business leaders need to become what we call norm makers. And norm making recognizes that we've got to push forward and adopt norms that may actually not improve business outcomes in the short term. And yet the commitment to operating within a social ecosystem, the commitment to operate with legitimacy puts pressure on, and I suggest creates a responsibility for top management to develop these norms nevertheless. And there are a few approaches that companies use. In some cases, companies simply step forward and lead by example. And an example of this that we talk about is the company CVS deciding, you know what, we're not going to sell cigarettes anymore. We see ourselves as a health company and we can't have our customers come in and walk past cigarettes behind the counter. That costs them billions of dollars of revenue. And the challenge therefore is, if you don't want to create an uneven playing field, what do? Companies frequently align with their competitors and develop new standards through trade associations. And that can be very powerful. It has the advantage of potentially being a quicker process than what I would generally recommend if companies can pull it off. And that is actually engage with stakeholders and listen, to pick up on Dr. Francis's remark there. Listen to the stakeholders and find out what they see as the issues and how you might actually find a norm that could be acceptable to your stakeholders and workable for your business. And this kind of multi-stakeholder initiative is a trend that we're certainly seeing over the last 15 years. And I think it's a very powerful space. And I'll just close, as my time is running up here, by saying that I've had the opportunity to work with one of the leaders at Unilever in the social sustainability effort. And her name is Marcela Manubens. And what she says is that she developed great friendships with strong critics. In particular, she really embraced a friendship with the leader of Amnesty International in the UK. And these critical friendships, I think, are instrumental in pointing companies towards ways of making ends meet that are responsive to business and society issues and continue to move the ball forward and provide these temporary workable answers to questions like, how sustainable is sustainable enough? These questions are challenging, but there's a legitimacy that results from arriving at tentative answers in community with impacted stakeholders. And I'll pause there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gaston. And so both those of us who've been in the sessions over the past couple of days, Gaston's remarks fit, especially with the previous panel where they were talking about how do we get technology in a way that makes sense to the stakeholders, in a way that makes sense to the community, when there are no norms, there are no rules, there are no understandings. And so we now know that if we're creative, if we listen, and if we begin to find ways to move forward, that we are able to then engage in that community building. And so for our last presenter, I have Brian Henning, who, as you can see from the sign behind him, is at the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment at Gonzaga University. And Brian comes to us from a theological, philosophical background, primarily philosophical. I ran into his work as he took one of my favorite authors, Alfred North Whitehead, and moved him ahead into a theory of ethics that could be useful as we begin addressing these problems. And so, Brian, I'll turn it over to you to share with us how you are intersecting with these issues.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm honored to be on the panel here with John and Gaston and Peter. I wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Spokane tribal people here in Eastern Washington State, and I'm grateful to be part of this biotic community. There's some interesting connections between my work, and I'm hoping we can continue to explore these in the minutes and maybe days to come. My work at the Climate Center as a philosopher has been interesting because it involves technical aspects, and there are important, as we know, technical aspects to addressing the climate crisis. We need to decarbonize energy and transportation as rapidly as we can. We launched this project at Gonzaga 2 years ago this week. And just a few months after that, we had experienced an intense heat dome in the Northwest that was in 2021, June and July. It killed 19 people in our county, 157 people in our state across that summer, over 700 people. And of course, this occurs now all too regularly. Just last summer in India, we see that something similar. This really made me realize that the university, my university, needs to do more to help our community to understand and begin to respond to the urgency of the problem. So we launched what we call the Beat the Heat initiative, which helped to map urban heat islands, began to survey our community. We're bringing together a stakeholder symposium to begin to listen to the community about what interventions we think we can pursue together to be better prepared for future extreme heat events. We hope to pursue something similar regarding wildfire smoke, since that's another chronic problem here in the West. Again, I'm in Eastern Washington State, where we have lots and lots of forests. So there are intense and urgent technical aspects to this problem that need to be pursued as urgently as we can to make for a sustainable future, a future in which we survive. What worries me as a philosopher as I pursue that work urgently and passionately is that there are futures wherein we survive, and maybe even futures which are, if we're fortunate enough to work hard, that might even be equitable, but are not still good enough. I worry that there are futures wherein we focus so much on surviving that we actually don't focus also on the wider biotic communities of which we're a part. I'm ultimately an environmental ethics professor and come at this problem from that perspective. And I'm reminded of a nice quote from Dale Jamieson, an environmental philosopher at NYU, who once said that economics can tell us how to achieve our ends efficiently, but not what our ends should be. And I think a lot about this question about ends that we are all too frequently inattentive to, and that we need to bring that to the surface, even as we pursue urgent technical solutions and policy victories. That what are the ends in view relative to which we're measuring success, and are we seeing ourselves as part of a broader community? I really enjoyed all of the comments today are kind of nicely fitting together. John and Gaston in particular are talking about these community values and norms, listening, bringing them up. And I'd like to encourage us to think not only about the human community and trying to do right by understanding all of those diverse values in our diverse human communities, but also the wider biotic communities of which we're a part and on which we depend, and the forms of listening that requires. Is really important not to lose sight of. I'm inspired by the 2015 document that Pope Francis wrote, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And Pope Francis called on, as he put it, all people of goodwill to pursue a form of integral ecology, a phrase, as far as I know, he made up, but looking to try and see how we can hear both the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth together. And this is something that environmental philosophers have not always been good at. Environmentalists have not been necessarily good at. That the old trope is that there are people who care about people and there are people who care about nature, and we don't have the luxury of thinking of them as separate any longer. We need to see ourselves as parts of, not apart from, the wider integrated wholes of which we're a part, on which we depend. I'm really also deeply inspired by the work of the cultural historian Thomas Berry, who recognized that reality is not best seen as a collection of objects, but rather a communion of subjects. This idea that we're part of a universe that's alive, that's developing, and that we can, as Catherine mentioned, one of my favorite philosophers is the British mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, who really tries, I think, to give a systematic account of what a universe would look like if we were to take Berry seriously, to see reality as a communion of subjects. It suggests that reality to exist is to have value for itself, for others, and for the whole, that everything that is has some degree of intrinsic value. And so my work has been just trying to figure out what would it be to take that seriously, both in my practical work directing the Climate Center and then my philosophical work as an ethicist. How do we center that in what we do? And I can't say that I'm particularly overly successful in doing that, but I really am attentive to trying to live within that space of imperfectly, infallibly pursuing what Barry calls the great work ahead of us, to conceive of forms of human living wherein we're mutually beneficial to the rest of the forms of life on the planet. And that to me would be an end truly worth pursuing. I worry that today, as we debate about the right climate targets, there are futures such as, the 2 degrees guardrail in Paris, or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Both of those are futures in which large segments of the natural world, of the rest of the biotic community, are effectively gone on human timescales. The species will go extinct and be forever gone. And that we don't necessarily, I think sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that we just need to pursue these urgent problems now and we'll get to those other problems later. And I think we need to recognize that actually for many of these problems, there isn't a meaningful later, that a species is gone, a glacier is gone, on human timescales, they're gone, and that we should recognize that we're making those decisions and saying we're satisfied with 1.5, or we're satisfied with 2, is to be satisfied with the permanent aspects of our biotic community being gone and being sacrificed, and there is no meaningful later for those members of the community. So I guess I'm going to pause there and hope that we have time to discuss with the panel and with folks who might be in attendance.
Thank you very much, Brian. I must confess that as I've sat through this conference for the past 2 days, I wished I would have had you guys in my back pocket, because there were questions that came up in each of the sessions that I would have liked your wisdom on. So what I'm going to try to do for a couple of questions, then we'll open it up to the audience to sort of frame what I was listening to and ask for your response back. One panel talked about artificial intelligence and the gathering of artificial intelligence as a way to get the data that you needed about what communities wanted. But the underlying question, and I think it was your question, was how do you build trust? How do you begin to sort through all of the noise, the different stakeholders' interests, and see which one is useful, which one is accurate? Did I catch your question about right? How would you, as ethicists, respond to strategies that people could take in order to rebuild trust or to discern what voices are trustworthy? Did that question make some sense? Who would like to
jump? I'd be happy to jump in first a bit. So we're in Eastern Washington State, which is quite conservative. Our local representative in Congress is Kathy Morris Rogers. It's really enjoyable and challenging to do this work in a very complex political environment. One of the things that we've done to try and build trust is to look for opportunities to frame this less in terms of locally as people who believe in climate change and people who don't. Lately, we're just focusing on helping people understand the magnitude of extreme heat events, magnitude of extreme smoke events, building long-term relationships and trust, which takes time, effort, showing up regularly, not being transactional, not just sort of looking for ways that we can parachute in and out, but looking for opportunities to listen, as John so beautifully shared, looking for opportunities to bring resources rather than take resources, looking for ways of doing research that's reflecting community values rather than telling them, as Gaston said, what they think or what they should think. It's a slow process, and so what I find myself troubled with is I don't think there's a better solution, but it's slow, and the problem is fast, and so I don't think there's a way around that. But I live in that daily of frustration of the only right way to do it is slowly, but the problem doesn't want to us to be. We wasted too much time to do it slowly, and so I don't have an answer about what to do about that, but I try.
Catherine, building on what Brian said around time, in a previous life, as some of you know, I was a medical officer in the Royal Navy. And during one battle, an admiral was told to abandon the British Army in a hopeless position. And he refused because he said, it has taken 500 years to grow the reputation of the Royal Navy. We can lose it in an afternoon. And the point was, it's very difficult to gain trust. It is very easy to lose it. Because I think once we've gained that trust, we need to make sure that we don't then do something very silly, which we think is very trivial, but actually loses that hard-fought trust.
John, as you're working in Africa, I was struck by a story you told us where you're working with people without electricity. And I have friends in South Africa where they're still not having electricity for the majority of people. How do you begin to build trust when there aren't enough resources for anybody and everything is fluid as those resources are accessed? You have to unmute yourself, dear. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Catherine, for that question. You know, South Africa is a very unusual place. It's the geography is quite striking, the landscape, and there are the two there's that two sides, the very well off, very rich and you know, blessed with electricity and running water and all those things that happen in a community that's supported by the government. And then there's the townships, which are you know, right next to these places of wealth, and then there's poverty. Even in the places where there is wealth, there is blackouts and rolling brownouts that happen daily. And it's one of the things that people experience in the wealthy parts of the country and say, you know, I'm going to leave. And then they're in the very impoverished parts of the country, in the townships, people experience this and they just seem so resilient, like, oh, well, we're going to fix that. You know, it's going to get better. And I'm inspired by the I guess my friend who had no water. They have no water that's provided by the township. So everything it's an informal community. You have to bring that in. They have to use hoses to go to someplace else, and they can get water from the township that is supported by the municipal government. Just talking with this person, I said to him, and because I have in my mind a number of people, I'm thinking of what we've done at Star Tides and all the companies that could provide this kind of assistance. You know, I said, I'll be coming back because I see you have been patient and you've put in these 12 porta potties on the main street. He said the main street used to be filled with sewage, John, but I was so patient, and I'm so patient that I was able to get these 12 porta potties in. And guess what? They're clean 3 times a week. And I was like, oh my, they're clean 3 times a week. And he was so happy, you know, and I said, I'm coming back, and I don't know how I'm gonna do this, but I'm gonna bring electricity to your section of this township. And so it was, you know, Brian said, it's going to take a long time. It's not instant. This man walked with me for 10 miles through the township, who was a night watchman in the city, and it takes him maybe 2 or 3 hours to get there to be a night watchman. But instead of sleeping, he wanted to walk with me because I was walking across Africa. He thought that was so important, and he wanted to stay up and walk with me. So there's just, what we do is where we are, what we can do and what we can say, and be that person. And, you know, it's like paying it forward. If everyone does that, you know, it's just going to spread. If millions of people do that, it's gonna spread, and it's gonna make a difference in the world. And if once he gets electricity, who knows what the next thing will be and what he will do and what that community will do for the community beside it. So I see that as a, you just do, it's like a journey and one step at a time, and you are where you are. You're not anyplace else. So the other thing I wanted to mention about sustainability, there's an indigenous idea of looking 7 generations ahead of where we are and saying, well, we're going to try to make this happen for 7 generations and make this, what are our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren, what are we leaving them? And what are we hopes for them? What are our aspirations for them? So I think that we need to go back maybe to some indigenous knowledge that we've kind of moved away from, just to look at it and see how it can be used where we are now. And so I'm going to mute myself again and let my colleagues answer some of your questions, Catherine. Thank you so much.
Well, another situation that came up in our conversations that Gaston, I actually wished you were here, had to do with what happens in a Florida or Puerto Rico as you've got rising water and you've got to move people. And the question becomes, who gets moved? How do they get built? How does it get rebuilt? And one of the, and I believe it was our keynote speaker, was a little discouraged, I guess, because what happens, he said, is that the community itself wants to have a good tax base. They want to bring in upper middle class people, and the poor people who were there when the waters came through or when the waters are rising are displaced because nobody wants them. How would you suggest, if one were an advocate for those who are being displaced, or how would you suggest that we have strategies to work to make sure that we don't displace those without resources as we are adjusting to these climate changes? And I know it's a really complicated question, so there it is.
Thank you, Catherine. So I guess that what I would say is that in addition to the principle of getting impacted people in the room, or really advocates for impacted groups into the conversation, the additional piece that becomes important is to create negotiation discussion structures that try to balance for power differentials. And we have some models of that. The ISO 26000 is an elaborate corporate responsibility standard, drew upon stakeholders of all kinds from around the world, and developed some techniques to try to balance the power between big companies and advocacy groups, so that the standards that emerged were not simply a reflection of the concentration of power. So that's a vague and general answer, but I think that's a key principle. And I guess to tap back into the prior question about trust, I think that something that will create a loss of trust that is difficult to recover is if business and governmental interests are embracing the lexicon of what's realistic in a way that is incompatible with the kind of comments that Brian made about the ecosystem survival. In other words, if what the general discourse that gets printed in the newspapers and that gets used by corporate boardrooms is that, we have to do what's realistic, but what's realistic is actually destructive of habitat and ecosystem and the quality of life in 10, 20, 30 years, then we've got a real problem with the use of words. And we need to be very critical to make sure that the words themselves are not creating the kind of imbalances of power that lead to distorted agreements among communities.
Brian, Peter, do you want anything you would like to say in response to that question? Or okay. All right, I think I'm going to open it up. Sure, Aaron.
This is on. Testing, not on. All right, now we're on. Okay, Aaron Rose here, off camera. Fascinating conversation. One of the things, I'm going to try to form this in a question, or just assume when I stop talking, there's a question mark at the end. One of the things that we're talking about battery's dead. Get a microphone. We have a good battery. One of the things that has been coming up when talking about resilience, sustainability, and then this is the world I operate in, is private sector development. And whether it's, we talk about the development of Africa, you need to create businesses and provide, capital and both financial and knowledge capital to people in Africa to develop, businesses so they can provide a living for themselves and their family and future generations, access to education. We talk about Puerto Rico, one of the panelists in Puerto Rico, and I wish I had the chance to ask the question, was talking about access to capital and sustainability, but then always talking about nonprofits. And, at least my own view, nonprofits really are not, there's a need for them, but it's very difficult to have a sustainable business model behind nonprofits unless you've got, deep pockets, like the Gates Foundation and whatnot. And so I'm very critical on that aspect. The Business Roundtable in 2019, as many know, redefined the definition of corporation and the responsibilities behind that, going beyond just the responsibility to the shareholders. Corporations should have a responsibility to its customers, to its employees, to its community. That, I think, is very wonderful when the economy is good. When the economy goes down, then it reverts back to the shareholders. We're talking about forming a corporation, a startup, let's say in Puerto Rico. If the person's putting up the capital, you have to, the risk to the investor is on that investor. And so I relayed this out because we're still trying to figure out, or at least I'm still trying to figure out in my mind, of how to reconcile the responsibilities of private sector development and the ethics behind this, whether it's in the United States, the UK, Western Europe, or in sub-Saharan Africa. And going forward, what do you have that society, very broadly, should keep in mind as we're talking about building sustainable models around either the private sector or education or access to resources? I hope that makes sense. I'm still muddled in my mind when I'm trying to ask, but I'll leave it there.
Well, and I think it goes, Aaron, to what we saw with one of the rebuilding where the electric system in Puerto Rico was down, and rather than go invest in solar, there had to be a reinvestment back in the electrical system, even though it may not have been sustainable in the end because of the concerns of both the private sector as well as the government. So, again, that's part of the context that we play with in those intersections of private business, government, and NGOs. So that gave you guys some time to think about it. Would like to respond to Aaron, and then we'll go back to another question. Gaston.
Aaron, I guess I'd just jump in and comment. I've done a lot of work thinking about corporate purpose and so on. And I'm not sure that the reversal, quote unquote, of orientation that was announced by the Business Roundtable really represents anything, any change. The evidence indicates that signatories are among the companies that have used the most share buyback since. And so to your comment about stakeholder orientation working when the economy is good, I'm not sure that it does. And as far as the importance of the signals and returns that shareholders care about, I think that shareholders, like everybody else, need to answer for their choices and can't hide behind the signaling system of the price mechanism. And so the idea that we can allow the price mechanism to operate without checks from discursive engagement, I think is a non-starter if we care about sustainability.
Peter, if I understand what you're doing, which I must confess I was fascinated with, but I probably don't understand it well. The notion that you have around blockchain of various people weighing in and validating begins to get around some of that issue of price alone driving, but also building trust within the commercial chain. Am I getting anywhere close to what you guys are doing?
Yes, I think, yes, you are. I mean, would increased knowledge about a product affect consumer purchases? Well, one would hope it would a bit. Would it completely do it? No, I'm sure it wouldn't. People are, if you are absolutely up against it, you're not going to want to do something which is inherently risky. You're going to want to do something which you can survive till tomorrow. And if that causes environmental degradation or anything else next week or next year, you're probably not going to be that worried about it. You know, we've seen it in the refugee work that we've done and things that people are very, very conservative with a small c when it comes to taking risks around that sort of thing. But giving people genuine and verifiable information about a product or about a service must be the right way to go. How people choose to use that information, that's a different question. And also that information can be challenged. So we have the concept of adversarial elements placed onto the blockchain. So somebody might say, this, I'll use an example of a piece of artwork, a favorite, this is definitely a Vermeer, and it's therefore valued at X million dollars. Another expert could come in and go, but actually I disagree for the following reasons. It then goes onto the blockchain. It stays there forever. You can't take that away from what we call the Materium Asset Passport, the digital twin of that good. So there is an element where you can share and challenge that information.
Thank you. Got a question?
Yes, thanks. First of all, just a great comment from Aaron earlier, because throughout my life, I've done a lot of work in poor communities from Chicago to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and around the world. And it could seem like to most people that a successful effort by a nonprofit proves that that community is not viable, and because the efforts that could be sustainable are not even possible, as proven by the very success of the nonprofit. Doesn't have to be that way, but you set yourself up for that kind of a problem. I was very interested on your ethical talk or perspective because of something really interesting. There's an intersection, I think, between resilient infrastructure and resources and resilient relationships. And lots of times, those of us who are involved in the technology and the business and everything else sort of don't get to that resilient relationship part, which makes it compelling to listen to each other in the first place. And so I was interested in that. And one of the opportunities, I think, comes about when you're looking at these what look like intractable problems like climate change. And when I work with critical infrastructure people, I experience in people's interactions what I call PTSD as pre-traumatic stress disorder. When the problem at hand is so big, it looks impossible, and they say, well, I might as well just give up now. And if you don't give them hope within 10 seconds, that fatalism sinks in very quickly. And you're already dealing with the problem that you mentioned where the urgent, I'm so overwhelmed with stuff right now, I can't possibly think of something more than that because I'm overwhelmed now already, and you're overwhelming me even more. So I think the opportunity for us on the ethical scale, among other things, is to be inventive in such a way where we can maybe bring to somebody a measure of hope that says something like this. I know you're under-resourced right now for the things that are taking you down in the near term. Maybe we can find a way to get other people's resources in your pocket today by addressing this long-term problem, because maybe this long-term problem can be couched in such a way that it brings you resources right now to solve your current problem. And I think that has a lot of ramifications to what I see in like microgrids and local energy systems that can solve that problem. But I think there may be the ethical approach you're taking that compels people to listen to each other that might give you the opportunity to discover how these large, overwhelming problems like climate change can be an opportunity to bring resource-distressed communities something now that they don't already have.
Thank you. As you were talking, I was thinking of Brian's work on imagination and how imagination plays in these relationships. Now, that may not be where you want to go, Brian, but I'll use that as a segue in to what your comment would be to this question and response.
Now I feel like I'm disappointing you in what I should be saying, Catherine, so you might have to give the answer you were thinking of, but two other quick thoughts, that interesting question. One, I spent 3 years as a climate activist here in the inland Northwest. And one of the things I learned was this phrase of change happens at the rate of trust. So this idea of taking the time to build relationships and proceeding at the rate of genuine relational trust has been an interesting and helpful way of approaching it. The second thought was something that we pursue in our what we call our climate literacy project. We have designed programs to do climate education in K-12 settings, both professional development workshops for teachers and direct instruction. We have college students go to elementary and middle school classrooms. And one of the approaches that we take is to make it local and keep it hopeful. It's kind of an updated version of the Think Global, Act Local sort of slogan from the early days of environmentalism. The make it local, keep it hopeful framing for us has been really useful because a lot of the despair and a lot of the despondency that's understandable is partly a product of making it and retaining, allowing it to stay a completely global problem. And of course, we need to be concerned about disproportionate impacts and the global effects, but we are local agents, most of the people that are in the world. So if you're going to look for opportunities for people to find hope, our own approach is to create meaningful forms of agency, whether it be for an elementary school student or a community member. So looking for ways of helping to create meaningful agency for people as an antidote to despair, helping them to understand what it looks like locally, and then the hopeful part is the agency part. So I'm not sure that doesn't pull in imagination as we're thinking of, Catherine, but those are the thoughts that popped into my head.
Yeah, it was one of the things that when we historically teach business ethics, we get this sort of list of, well, here are the different theories and here what it is. And you're going to apply the norms to those theories. And as Gaston said, those old approaches are not useful. And so as we begin to think together and imagine what would hopefulness look like, what would 7 generations look like, what would it look like to get excited about porta potties that are cleaned 3 times a week, that engaging the collective vision, I think, is part of how we get past the log jams that have been presented a lot of times today. So it's that envisioning a future that is farther down the road than we have. Other questions in the audience? Yeah. Sure.
All right. Hey, I'm Kyle Bradley. I work for the Navy. A lot of engagement with defense leadership, government leadership. So I'm going to start with my question. I'm going to provide some context and then come back to the question. Question is, what's the role of government, or how do you see the role of government in addressing climate change? And specifically looking at U.S. government. First of all, a lot of great narrative here. I've taken a lot of notes, a lot of terms that I'm still processing, trying to digest. Integral ecology. I love the discussion or the point around 1.5 versus 2. Who's a norm maker, who's not a norm maker? Maybe we all are, I don't know. Listening, and we're 20 minutes from the Capitol building here. Who's listening, who's not? Stakeholders. I'm going to my second page of notes here. Duty versus value. If I can come back to stakeholder. Politically, we have representatives that have a duty of X and a value of Y, right? So they're torn themselves. So we have that challenge here. So the political environment here is a challenge. There are a lot of us that, well, I think all of us believe we're fighting the right fight, right? But it's not always the same fight. I've been an advocate for mitigation for a while, and within the DoD, that's a tough one. Fortunately, when it comes to adaptation, it's almost the same mission. Like adapting to climate change is the same mission of being ready for a war fight. The mitigation, not so easy. And more often than not, if we're bringing up climate change, there are a lot of folks that get defensive on the topic because it is so polarizing. So, all right, back to my question. And it's really, what is the federal government not doing now that it maybe should be doing? Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Who wants to take that one on first? Gaston?
I'll just speak very briefly. Thank you. That's a critical question. What I would say is that from the side that I work on, thinking about the responsibility of management and companies, what we need from companies is for them to actually be lobbying and activating in government for the same kinds of policies that they're marketing to the public. Unfortunately, the largest companies are very good about presenting a green image, and whatever commitments they're making, they're celebrating, and that's fine. The challenge is that they're not actually putting their money where their mouth is in terms of pressuring Congress to take action. So we need companies to be behind the kind of government action that's actually going to be needed, and it is absolutely needed. So we do need the federal government to start acting further on the environmental front, and we need companies to be supporting that rather than doing nothing or getting in the way.
Other thoughts? One of the things I always thought, as one who taught public policy, so Gaston and I did a lot of that work in our classrooms, is that companies look to the government to set regulations that become the floor, that everybody's going to be on the same page, and everybody will have the same competitive advantage. And if we forget that that is part of the primary function of regulations, we wind up with the floors going down and people winding up with a competitive game playing that doesn't support the environment. So I agree with Gaston, the notion of having the companies support at the regulatory level what they put on their websites would be a huge step forward in putting together policies that everybody could live into. Yeah.
So how do you incentivize? Is there a? That's a laudable goal, but how do you incentivize the companies to actually do that? When, I mean, we had this discussion earlier of stakeholder versus shareholder, and unfortunately, the whole capitalist economy is based on the profit motive and the ideology / mythology that prices are actually the signal that is needed to get the good for society, the good for all, and it obviously is not working. But how does that? We can sit here at an ethical panel and say, yeah, this is ethically what the companies should do, but how do we make that actually happen?
Well, one of the things that we do is actually make people aware of what the price is. And Peter, that was part of when I was on your website, I was fascinated with how you supported transparency in those actual transaction costs. Was I reading it that accurately about what you were doing?
That's certainly part of it. It's trying to price in all of the externalities, whether that's a price in terms of actually pounds, shillings, and pence, or that's in terms of what the broader value of something is, in terms of how it's made, is to actually make it very clear what the true cost of something is.
And for those of us who've done public policy our entire life, that notion of taking the externalities that get pushed out onto the community and actually moving them back into the cost for the companies becomes really important. So all the environmental work has to come back to being a real cost for the company that gets factored into the price. And then, of course, you get into the international settings. And many of my students get sort of really torn in these issues where they want to honor the rules of local communities that do not have higher environmental standards. At the same time, they want to have a clean environment all the way through. And so I think you're exactly right, that actual cost and then dealing with the differential in an international setting is a nut to crack. Okay, we're getting close to the bottom of the hour, and what I like is for each of you to just do a couple, 3 minutes of reflection on what you have listened to and the questions that you would like us to take away as we go off onto our work. I'm going to do it clockwise from how I see it, which is Peter, John, Gaston, and then Brian.
I think clearly companies and business have a role to play here. I was very taken up. So I think one of the earlier questions talked about non-profits being the solution or being not the right solution. And I absolutely agree with that. You know, I've done a lot of charity work as well. And one of our kind of mantras was we wanted to make ourselves out of business as a charity. That said, businesses shouldn't and can't operate in a complete open field. There has to be some regulation in order to properly price in everything around a product or a service, because failure to do that businesses will take the shortcut. You know, they will go for the big profit if they can. So ethics, yes, it's important. Ethics isn't something that one just does as an add-on at the end of having decided on the product and everything else. Oh, we better just chuck in a bit of ethics here to make it look good. It should form the very basis of what a company does. And you know, that is one of the joys I have in working with the company I work with, is that we are very early on in our business journey, and ethics has formed a very important part of it right from the word go. And I would just come back to that question that Susan Lautard poses and suggests is, don't just say this is wrong or this is what we should do, or we must never do this. Is when and under what circumstances would you do this? And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Peter. John?
Thank you very much. And, you know, I would say what Peter said. And also I'd like to add that, you know, while I was at the Coast Guard, we were working on the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 staff, and we had to come up with the new regulations on pollution and such, and cleanup and reliability. And we got all the stakeholders together. What we did was something called regulatory negotiations, so that before we came up with a regulation, all the stakeholders got in a room, the oil companies, the environmental groups, and got in a room along with a judge. This is after the whole regulatory process went through publishing what the regulations might be. But they all got into a room, and with the judge, they all negotiated what was acceptable to each group, and then signed an agreement in front of the judge saying, look, we're not going to try to prolong this or throw this in front of a court so that the resources we're trying to protect are not protected while we're battling it out. We understand the importance of this, and we're going to do it right here, right now. And so I think something like regulatory negotiations for when we were talking about policy is something that we might consider more of than what we do now. I know, very painful process, but I think it's worthwhile. And I'm going to end my comments there and thank everybody for being part of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Gaston?
Thank you. So I've sought to provide a general framework to think about how to address the issues that aren't properly incentivized as is. And so to the question from the audience, how do we incentivize companies to actually support the right kind of legislation and regulation? First thing I would say is that we need to shatter the ideology that makes us think that this is the only way. That's a big project. I guess it's what I try to do as an instructor, but more broadly, I think that it's time for people in the United States to start taking to the streets more. We need to raise the alarm and I guess learn learn from our brothers and sisters across the Atlantic who know that you can get a government to listen when you get on the streets.
Okay, and then Brian.
Thanks, everybody. I'd like to return to this idea that economics can tell us how to achieve our ends efficiently, but not necessarily what our ends should be or whether we should be concerned even to achieve them efficiently. And discussions of ends are ultimately, for me, discussions of underlying fundamental values. And I've thought a lot about the fact that environmentalists over the last 50 years have made some impressive successes, but too often there's a concern that we framed our approach in largely negative terms. What we're against extinction, we're against water pollution, against air pollution. Those are good things to be against, but we need to connect to something Catherine mentioned. We need to do more to also imagine, to inflate our moral imagination. What is the world we're trying to create together? And although that's abstract, it's particularly incredibly practical. It's the measuring stick relative to which any given action it should be taken. We should say this is good or this is bad, this is progress or regress relative to some really beautiful vision. And so I fear that sometimes the civil rights movement has done a good job and something that the environmental movement has not. Although it's clear that it's, we should be against segregation, against racism. The civil rights movement has beautifully been motivated by things like Dr. King's vision of the beloved community, wherein we're all trying to create this more equitable future together. That I would argue that positive vision of the future is what really animates people going into the streets, as Gaston put it, and people really, if we're going to have an intergenerational project in front of us, and we do, that can really only be sustained by a vision of a beautiful future, which even if there wasn't a crisis would be worth fighting for. And so I think it's worth spending time on our moral imagination and imagining exactly what that future is that we're all trying to bring about together, even as we are in the trenches slogging away on the policy that needs to be pursued today and today and today. So thanks so much for having us, Catherine. This has been a lot of fun.
I just want to again thank each of you for participating. My life has been enriched by working with you all over the past couple months, and I look forward to the conversations continuing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.